Okay, good afternoon and welcome everyone. I would like first to acknowledge that we are presently located and working on the traditional territory of the Nkoche or Anacostia in Piscataway, Native peoples whose lands were forcibly taken and who have yet to receive justice. My name is Atiya Ahmed. I'm an anthropologist, gender studies scholar, and interim director of the Institute of Middle East Studies, along with my colleagues Shana Marshall, Christian Clinton, and Manatia, who's on a much-deserved sabbatical break. We have organized today's event, the latest in our ongoing I Miss Conversation series. Today's conversation centers on States of Subsistence, the Politics of Bread in Contemporary Jordan, that was published last April with Stanford University Press and was written by José Martínez, who is here with us today, who is currently a lecturer in politics at the University of York. Previously, he was a junior research fellow at Trinity College at the University of Cambridge. José's research explores the politics of food, welfare, drugs, and political authority in the Middle East and North Africa, drawing on both archival and ethnographic methods. He is committed to modes of political inquiry, attentive to the seemingly ordinary and mundane. Building on more than a year working as a baker in the Jordanian capital of Amman, José's first book, States of Subsistence, which we'll be discussing today, wrestles with theories of performativity to dissect the ways in which welfare provision in the form of food works to entrench the state in everyday life. He is currently working on his next major project, funded by the ESRC's new investigator grant, provisionally entitled Sovereign Haze, Hashish, Trafficking and the Illicit in the Western Mediterranean. The project explores practices of government and the exercise of authority in southern Spain and northern Morocco by way of the production and trafficking of hashish. In conversation with José today is Ilana Feldman, who's a professor of anthropology, history, and international affairs here at GW and the former dean of the Elliott School. Her research
Intern.
Oh, her research has focused on the Palestinian experience, both inside and outside of historic Palestine, examining practices of government, humanitarianism, policing, displacement, and citizenship. In addition to continuing work on humanitarianism, Professor Feldman is researching the central place of Palestine and efforts to solve the Palestinian problem in shaping international institutions and discourse. She is the author of many books, and I'll highlight the two most recent: Police Encounters, Security and Surveillance in Gaza Under Egyptian Rule, published in 2015, and Life Lived in Relief, Humanitarian Predicaments and Palestinian Refugee Politics, published in 2018. Now, before turning it over to José and Ilana, I would be remiss if I didn't tell you about other upcoming events here at the Institute of Middle East Studies. First is a co-sponsored event with the Gender Equality Initiative in International Affairs, taking place on International Women's Day this coming Wednesday, March the 8th, and it's entitled Woman, Life, Freedom, International Women's Day event featuring Azar Nafisi. And second is our annual conference taking place on April the 28th. It is entitled Imaginary Divides, the Middle East and Africa Across Empires, Oceans, and Borders. Thank you and welcome again.
So, hi everyone. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, and really appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to speak. So, I'm going to begin with a brief vignette that I think captures a lot of what I'm trying to do in the work. I'm going to apologize to those who have read parts of this vignette already. Hani paused to refill his glass, asking for the sugar as he complained one last time about my recurring failure to make the tea sweet enough. I started to offer my usual response. I prefer tea with sugar, not sugar with tea. But he cut me off. Though convivial and kind, Hani was not one to digress. Business was his creed, bakeries and restaurants, pillars of his conversation. The rest was futile chit-chat. Today was different, though. I had only a few hours left before my new flight. I knew the last people I wanted to see. At 9 in the morning, the bakery was sweltering, muggy, damp, stifling. The oven's flame had just been turned down. The morning rush hour had given way, to a brief lull. Everyone's exhaustion was palpable. The bakers behind Hani scarcely managed a tire wave as I yelled my greetings to those inside this life-giving crypt. Already these bakers were sweating, dripping, and steaming. The workday here had started 4 hours earlier, and they had at least another 10 hours to go. Hani's shirt was coated with flour, a thin off-white dusting that suggested he had been required to bake that day, an increasingly uncommon occurrence given his age and station. Bakery owner for the past 20 years and a salaried baker for 20 before that, he has seen Jordan's commercial bread industry be born, rise, and ripen. His bulging neck and barrel chest speak of a life of exhausting manual labor. He owes his protruding forearms, lower back pains, which he left complaining, and disjointed but nimble wrists to incalculable hours spent making bread. And he describes himself as a khubz, a baker. He bakes and sells khubz, bread, for a living. The Jordanian government began subsidizing the price of this foodstuff in 1974. Ever since, bakers like Hani have worked with government regulations and ministerial inspections, alongside flour and yeast, to provide what has become the country's most important staple. Hani often reminded me that in the early years, this bread was a novelty, something that only the displaced and destitute ate. Others still grew and milled wheat and made their own dough, which they then baked in a village or neighborhood oven. Fairly quickly, however, population growth and foreign cereals undercut these practices. Soon, everyone found it easier and cheaper to swing by the bakery and purchase what was once disparagingly called khubz, bread from the market. By 2013, the first year I came to Hani's, there were more than 1,500 bakeries operating across Jordan. The vast majority were small, unassuming establishments with at most 6 or 7 employees. These bakeries receive a discounted flour quota from the Ministry of Industry, Trade, and Supply, which they then use to make subsidized bread available to all residents of Jordan, not just citizens, all residents. Profits were consistent, but not particularly abundant. The bakery is a volume business, one that is enhanced if the owner can buy the ingredients and machinery necessary to make more profitable cookies and pastries. Hani did neither. His bakery made subsidized bread, nothing more, nothing less, and it did this well. If one has bread, one has life, and what better than to give life? Hani was fond of asking after a strenuous day. We give life. On this last day, Hani reached over my shoulder to grab the small carton of sugar from a nearby counter, then waited while I served the other's tea. Before I finished, I heard his gruff voice behind me calling my name. Jose, so what will you tell the world you've learned, he asked, besides how to mess up a cup of tea? Enveloped in clouds of flour, I thought about operating the mixer and working the oven. I remembered days spent shaping unformed dough and rolling it into temporary submission. But I knew this was one of those questions that Hani asked only to answer it himself before anyone else could chime in. That we live only for bread? That we exchange it for freedom? He probed as he grabbed the back of my neck affectionately. No, he chuckled. We had discussed overtly political topics on only a few occasions. It was usually late at night, after some of the workers had left, and in response to a particular news story or personal travail. Discerning and caustic in equal measure, Hani did not particularly resent the Jordanian, although he found the entire premise of monarchy baffling. His critiques of American empire were cutting, but not particularly aggrieved. It was the impulse to govern, to rule and exercise power over others that troubled him. No, there is no exchange, Hani stated, as the rest of us listened. They give us bread and nothing more. We have no say, no escape, because we are part of the same system we oppose. Sometimes we forget, but because we are used to it. Used to what? One of the bakers shouted. Hani gave a knowing smile, the whole room silent at his feet. Used to being governed, used to feeling that way every single day. To my mind, Hani's account is illuminating in its sensibility. It is colored by shrewd discontent, but unmarred by embittered doctrines or naive reductionism. Hani is alert to the contradictions that characterize political action and the conundrums that come with being governed by something we can feel, hear, smell, and discuss, but never really see. Hani knows that while he may act and achieve, he is also always and inevitably being acted upon. He can discern the contours of the script that both empowers and disempowers him. Circumstances that are familiar, hardly reassuring. Conscripted into a world not of his own choosing, here I'm drawing on David Scott's book, Hani seeks no easy escape from tragedy, knowing full well that he is obliged to live amid the violences, exclusions, and inequalities that compose modern mechanisms of rule, the state foremost amongst them. Like most of us, he has nowhere to go. My focus on subsidized khubz arabi, also known as Arabic or pita bread, as both an ethnographic object and an analytic vantage point, is driven by its omnipresence in Jordan. One can stumble upon this bread or on something made with it on almost any block of the country's cities and towns. Everyone eats it, poor and working classes rely on it, many refugees cannot live without it. But subsidized bread does more than nourish, nurture, and sustain. It generates effects in excess of its alimentary needs. And so the book argues that the recurring provision of khubz arabi engenders a relationship to political authority, to the structure and sovereign deemed accountable for its presence. And so the book is not a detailed study of Jordanian bakeries, nor does it offer a social history of bread or bread rockets. It is instead an attempt to study the state ethnographically, in places where it is rarely displayed. Through a variety of settings and historical moments, and in conversation with a diverse range of interlocutors, the book seeks not just to interrogate the state's apparent unity or expose its inconsistencies, but to think through some of the ways the state maintains its solidity and inevitability. How? Through what practices and modes of address? I tackle this question through the prism of khubz arabi and the welfare program that ensures its discounted provision. Bread may seem like a weird way to do this, but we have all waited in line for food. The familiar monotony of purchasing a basic foodstuff and consuming it among neighbors and coworkers makes such occasions easier to dismiss as having political impact of any kind. The book, then, is a call to pause, to consider both the routine practicalities and broader repercussions of such moments. It addresses how subsidized bread is made, moved, and managed, as well as the ways in which it is demanded, distributed, and desired. Most centrally, it asks why bread is there and what it is doing. How come bread is never lacking when so many other things do? Why do so many in Jordan continue to demand that it be made available as a public good? What are the politics of this food? The view from Hannah's. Not one careless word, not a single furtive glance. An unplanned cadence saturated the bakery. Movement was constant, draining exertions relentless. I tried to remain calm, but was edgy and uneasy. It was mid-December, and a snowstorm had been forecast for the following day. Hanny's bakery was packed. No one knew for certain whether the roads would be traversable tomorrow or the next day. Everyone, or so it seemed to me, was rushing out to make sure they had enough khubz arabi to ride out the storm. This bread was insurance, protection against deprivation. Many in the neighborhood could afford nothing else. Inside, the oven pulsated. Trays filled with rising dough were continuously stacked. Hanny yelled to the bakers behind him, frantically trying to transmit bigger, bake, guys, bake. Then after, bake more. No one could leave empty-handed. Not a soul could be left without nourishment. 7 hours later, 10 in the evening, the work abated as the bakery shut its doors. On this day, twice the usual amount of subsidized bread and sold. Many customers thanked Hanny as they departed, believed that something had summoned the resolve to ensure their subsistence. Here, no one can live without bread. During the next 48 hours, the streets were covered in slick ice. Only a few brave residents ventured outside to face the cold. In East Amman, it is the responsibility of locals to remove the snow. No organization or institution arrives to assist them or make certain that they have endured. For 2 full days, Hani's bakery, Al Khalil, was closed. The following day, the bakers and the bakery owner returned. I arrived half an hour late. Buses had been scarce and taxis unwilling to negotiate the deceptive uphill pathways covered in slush. I apologized, set my things down in the back room, and got to work. I was visibly irritated by the commute and my now soaked shoes. Hanny jokingly asked whether I had been inconvenienced by the winter chill. No, I responded, by the icy streets, by the lack of central heating, by the unending stream of grimy water that has inundated my street. Everyone stopped. They all began to laugh. What do you want? What did you expect? One of the bakers asked. A radiator in your kitchen and a jacuzzi instead of a bath? Flummoxed, I had no idea how to respond. And so, eventually, after I had complained about slippery roads and frozen pipes, electricity blackouts and flooded alleyways, I asked, well, who is responsible for the mess? Why doesn't someone deal with this? Where is the state? Annie scanned my face and gave me a wistful look as the others groaned at my privilege. I waited and wasn't sure what to expect. Where is the state? He muttered back, jaded. Here, at the bakery, in every bread.
Thank you for that wonderful entry into the book. And actually, before, I'm really excited to be in conversation with you, but before we do, I realized I should ask, at what point should I conclude and turn things over to questions from the audience? I'm not sure what our schedule is.
Questions, and I'll signal you have some, otherwise you can just keep going until you're out of questions.
All right, great. So, but I love the focus on bread as an entry point, and in what you introduce, you give a good sense of why it is valuable. I always start my first day in my undergraduate anthropology of the Middle East class with bread, showing them pictures of bread, and then talking about the whole range of things one can see in bread, precisely for not exactly the same reasons, but precisely as you point out, there is so much in this object. And for anthropology students, I kind of want to point out so much in any object, but bread is especially multiple in its meanings, in its politics, in its trajectories. So I love that. And you've already made your case very strongly for why, but I thought it would be interesting, actually, before we go further into talking about the parts of your argument, if you might tell us something about how you got there. Right, so it's very clear what you can see through bread from the book, but what led you to this? And particularly I think of our students who are thinking about projects, thinking about how do you research the very big, complicated questions that you're interested in the world, and what led you to see bread as the place that you wanted to put your ethnographic attention?
So yeah, this is a great question, and I guess I would probably echo anthropologists rather than political scientists, and that it has to do a lot with the sort of life events, occurrences that happen. So I spent about a year in Syria, 2010, studying Arabic after my undergrad, and I did a homestay. And I discovered after a few days that the sort of host family, the father of the house, made menaish, which are these sort of flatbreads that people who have lived or know the Levant would be familiar with. And in front of them, there was also a bakery. And so at the time, it was just my sort of naive way of trying to practice language skills, to offer sort of free labor. And I also love carbohydrates, bread, food. So I thought, okay, I'll eat for free as well, or just heavily discounted. And what was curious to me was that at the time, and still in Syria, the subsidized bread was called khubz. So quite literally, bread of the state was sort of imprinted on it's metaphorically imprinted on every loaf of bread. And so I thought, okay, there's clearly a lot going on here. It's a very loaded term. I had read about sort of bread riots and sort of these classic accounts. I'm thinking of Larbi Sadiqi's work on bread and the social contract in the Middle East. And so I knew from then, far before the PhD, that there was sort of subject matter that I wanted to dig into if I could. And so, yeah, I guess life took me to a PhD. And then when I was thinking about the project, one of the things my advisor at the time said, it's like, do something you're passionate about, because you're probably going to be working on this for a long time. And so if you're already bored by it, or if it's something you can envision being bored by rather quickly, don't do it. And so the bakery, I guess at the time, during that sort of work experience, it wasn't really a work experience, it was once or twice a week during the mornings before sort of language class. I really enjoyed the sort of routine. It was a hub of camaraderie. I saw there were a lot of, it was sort of a window into neighborhood life that I would not get through any other prism. And so the kernel, I guess, was always there. And then, yeah, I guess sort of went to graduate school and started reading stuff on bread and found it all somewhat unfulfilling. A lot of great things have been published since then that are, I think, much better. I'm thinking especially about sort of Sophia, some of Paul Robbins' work on bread in Palestine. And yeah, that non-fulfillment with existing works, mainly in political science, on bread and the sort of personal experience melded together. And I was like, well, okay, let me spend some time doing this. And Jordan ended up being the place for a whole bunch of reasons I can get into. But yeah, that was, so yeah, I guess a personal story more than anything.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's often the way. And maybe I would at some point like to turn to sort of the Jordan question of this. But I wanted to maybe next ask you a little bit about sort of ethnography of the state from the ground up. And I should say, so, you are a political scientist, I'm an anthropologist, but you are pretty close to, to the ways that anthropologists think. And maybe this is something also to think about, to talk about at some point, how you decided on an ethnographic approach. Like for anthropologists, that is kind of the method, that's what you got to do. If you're going to do something else, you'd have to really make a strong case that you probably wouldn't succeed in making as a PhD student. But it is more, I mean, obviously there's a lot of other political scientists who do ethnography, but it's definitely a minority approach.
Right.
So at some point, maybe you can maybe reflect on that as you answer, but I wanted to sort of ask you about is the kind of conceptual. And as I was reading your work and how you talk about it, I was thinking, not surprisingly, about Michelle Rolfe-Trio, who's an anthropologist, kind of arguments about how to approach an ethnography of the state. And just to read a very brief quote from his arguments, he says, by focusing on state effects through the lived experience of subjects, we can build an ethnography of the state from the ground. We may have to look at these processes and effects in sites less obvious than those of institutionalized politics and established bureaucracy. So it's an argument, about both the scale at which you start and the places in which you start and what can be revealed in that. I, have written about civil servants and bureaucratic practice in Gaza. So when thinking about an ethnographic approach to state effects, I often note actually that we don't only need to look in less obvious sites and outside of bureaucracies, but can make more obvious sites and bureaucracies amenable to a kind of ground up ethnographic inquiry of state effects. So this was a long kind of opening to note that you in this book focus on bakers and bureaucrats. So you're crossing a divide between the institutions of the state, seen ethnographically, and the institutions of state effects, also seen ethnographically. So again, I wondered if you could, one, talk a little bit about that choice to focus on both of these. What is revealed and maybe revealed differently about the state and state effects in each of those sites? And then what is revealed, sorry if everything is like a multi-part, what is revealed in their intersection? Because not surprising, very often what you are describing is places where these two sites are coming together, these two sets of actors, two locations are encountering each other.
Yeah, I mean, all great questions. Trio, I'm a huge fan of, and his work pushed me to think doing this work in the way it ended up being done. How I got to doing both, I mean, it was, I think, one of those sort of serendipitous things. I started with the bakers and figured that was always going to be a hub, but then Jordan has a bakery owners association, which is sort of a trade group that amalgamates all the bakery owners. And there is a somewhat cordial relationship with the ministry that provides, or that is charged with this sort of bread subsidy program. And so the president of the association said, yeah, you need to spend some time with the government to understand what they're doing. We don't really always get what they're trying to do, especially the higher up levels, but your story would be incomplete if you didn't go there. So I thought, okay, this is a curious statement and an odd way of thinking about things, but in the end was rather convincing in terms of pushing me to see it through both those different eyes. And then there were a whole bunch, there's your work, a few other sort of foundational works on things like bureaucracy and sort of more traditional state institutions, if you will, that made me think about possibly trying to combine those prisms or seeing what they can offer us in their intersection. And the tactics chapter is where I really try to do this. Some of the chapters where I'm talking about how inspectors go in and try to negotiate the implementation of the subsidy while bakers are trying to, in some cases, make an illicit profit, and other times using flour in illegal ways, technically illegal ways, to serve noble ends. And I think what comes through in that intersection are the sort of the plasticity of the state effect, the different ways in which people can use and manipulate it to their own ends in ways that just assuming the bread subsidies implementation never quite answers. And so a lot of political scientists will conceive of a bureaucracy as something that fails to do what it's being tasked to do or succeeds. And there's a whole bunch of middle ground between those two outcomes that I think is usually where a lot of the interesting stuff is happening. And so I think both methodologically and analytically, what trying to do both of those did was to say, okay, let me think about that intersection as a site that then reveals plasticity, complicity, other things that are going on here that looking at just one or the other wouldn't necessarily fulfill. And I think that's why Trujillo is salutary, but then Trujillo doesn't seem all that interested in bureaucrats. And I, after spending some time with them, as I'm sure you can attest to, I found them kind of fascinating, especially the lower down the chain you went. In many cases, especially around the bread subsidy, these were people who had worked in bakeries before, they had extensive experience in private flour mills. Jordanian government is very cognizant of how important this subsidy is, and it does a very good job of recruiting people for these jobs. And, they could talk about anything from gluten structure to varieties of wheat, what countries are trying to gain the international wheat market. And they ended up just being very interesting and pleasant people to spend time with. And then also had a very different outlook on the state than both those above them in the ministerial hierarchy and also the bakers. And so I thought that clash or that difference in perspective illuminated far more than it obscured, and thought, well, why not? If they, it's also in the end a question of access on some level, is they let me to sort of tag along in ways that I was lucky to, and probably I definitely benefited from sort of the gender identification, the fact that I was male in a very heavily male environment. And if they hadn't let me do those things, I might not have been able, or I might not have been able to write about it. And so those sort of eureka moments when doors are somehow open to people in the field, I think I was also aided by that, if I were to be completely honest about how it ends up being of interest.
That leaves your answer is going to make me jump ahead into a different question. But actually, when you were just talking, I wondered, so you said that one of the things that Hanny said to you is we are part of the same system that we oppose. Of course, it's like his Foucauldian analysis of his own circumstance. But would the bureaucrats that you worked with have said the same thing, or what would their analysis be of their relationship to the system?
Wow. Okay. Fascinating question. I don't think I could sort of generalize what they all think. I think it would probably vary depending on both level and positioning vis-a-vis the government. There were some that were quite critical, especially of the neoliberal turn and sort of economic policy, who saw the bread subsidy as this one last shining remnant of care towards the population exploitation of a far more generous welfare state that used to exist. But I don't think any of them would consider themselves oppositional to the regime in ways Hani might. And so there was a commitment to the Jordanian government, the Jordanian nation, especially. Most of them were recruited from the sort of East Bank sort of areas outside of Amman, the supposed tribal base of the regime. And that's been complicated by a few scholars working on the topic. But yeah, I'd say far less oppositional in general than the bakers, but equally critical in their own way. So while the bakers found the bureaucracy frustrating, the bureaucrats found the lack of bureaucracy or the lack of government intervention in other sectors quite frustrating. And so they were all opposed to something. Whether it's the same thing, I'd probably say not.
Right. So it's the difference may be what they understand, what is the system in that sentence of
Absolutely.
oppose.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So you were just talking about the kind of complex work of bureaucrats. So that's leading me, and I'm going to come back to an earlier question. I'm going to go ahead to ask you about craft, actually. And both to invite you to describe for people who haven't yet read the book some of what you say about that, but also to ask you some questions. So, you give a lot of attention in this book to the craft of bread making, and obviously to statecraft. I really love the way that you describe bakers needing to collaborate with their ingredients. So first thing, it's just an invitation to share with people who haven't yet read the book some of what you describe about that kind of craft of bread making. But then also to ask, I think it might seem more obvious or more, immediately clear to people that bread requires craft, right? I think many people spent their pandemics trying to develop the craft of bread making, right? So that's something, that we might recognize as craft work. But you very clearly describe bureaucratic practice as not in any way simply like rule following, paper pushing, making sure things, are checked off, but as really entailing craft. So I want to ask you to also say a bit more about sort of the bureaucratic craft and how that shapes the governance of welfare provision.
Yeah, no, I can talk about this, for a very long time. One of the things that befuddled me about the bakery is that no one used the recipe. So there's this recipe sort of taped in the back room near the flour mixer. And so, the first week I'm there, I'm like jotting it down, going back, constantly looking at it as this, and everyone just like was either making fun of me or sort of laughing at me. And after a while they explained, like, look, the recipe is of very little use, right? It can give you broad outlines, but never shrewd maneuvers. And what they meant by that, I realized later, was that they need to collaborate with ingredients, right? So yeast, flour, when it becomes dough, is alive in a certain sense. And because a lot of these bakeries are not sort of hyper-sterilized commercial establishments, things like weather impact how long the dough takes to rise, how hot it is inside, what the flour mixer, how old it is, and how often they've changed the paddles on the mixer. And so I got to craft thinking about, because I was expecting sort of rule following procedures, recipes, and what I got was something completely different. And what I found was a lot of tacit knowledge. And so only when I stopped looking at this recipe, stopped writing down the instructions people give me, write them down, stop writing it down, only when you get a feel for the game, as Richard Sennett said, did I finally begin to bake half decent bread and not be sort of an embarrassment, or they put me at the cash register sometimes just to get me out of the way. And it was because you would stop thinking of it, you begin to think of it as a craft, as something that is not, one cannot learn through explanation. And I think we tend to think about craft in terms, baking makes sense as craft. There are certain industries, certain professions, certain things that we do in life that we think of as not rule regimented, not necessarily following procedures, that require sort of an unwritten knowledge. And then when I started spending time with the bureaucrats going around on inspection, I realized they're doing something quite similar, because I would ask them, how do you become a good inspector? And they're like, well, you just kind of know what's going on at the bakery. So these inspectors will go into bakeries and they have a few methods through which they try to figure out if the bakery is cheating the system. Cheating the system is either selling on subsidized flour to make non-subsidized bread or pastries or cookies, or selling on the subsidized flour to a macaroni or a pasta factory that uses the subsidized flour to make other goods. The subsidized flour costs 1/10 what the non-subsidized flour costs. So you can make a lot of money if you're selling this on a grand scale, or just an extra few dollars if you are doing it sort of on a smaller scale. And I remember vividly, one of the stories that's in the book is when I'm accompanying these inspectors who are going through the neighborhood. They're looking at different bakeries, and there's one bakery that's clearly full and that has all its receipts in order, but something seems off. They can't quite figure out why it is that there's no custom at the bakery that day. And so one of the things these inspectors do is they'll ask for receipts of yeast, because usually the amount of yeast will be equivalent to the amount of flour, like a 1:30. They have a ratio for all these things. And you can tell that the bakery is not making subsidized bread if they barely are buying any yeast. And so in this case, they ask them for their electricity receipts, because another way you can tell the bakery is working, right, is if the electricity is on, what they're paying in receipts. And the bakery owner comes out and the electricity receipt is for like $5. So the inspectors look around, they look at each other, they look at me, they look at the bakery owner, and they're like, well, this doesn't make any sense. You can't be a full-time bakery and have an electricity receipt cost $5. So they sort of look around, and what do? They sort of pop outside of the bakery and they look up at the electricity lines. They look at the bakery owner looks back, and he looks at, and he tells the inspectors after they threaten him with fines, yeah, I steal the electricity. And so the inspectors, I'm expecting them to call someone to make them issue a fine, and all they do is say, It's fine. They can tell that this bakery is central to sort of life in this neighborhood, that it's a lot of people are quite dependent on it. And closing it down would mean people having to go much farther for their daily bread. It would mean, a 2-month process by which penalties are issued to this one bakery. And they say, forget about it. Just keep on doing the bread, but sort out the electricity. So next time we come, your receipts look like they should be legitimate. And this is not how I was taught to conceive of bureaucracies, right? So I am a big fan of David Graeber's work, but one of the big things that I take issue with is his depiction of bureaucrats as mindless cogs in a Kafkaesque machine that just make our lives miserable. And I have dealt with bureaucrats who seem like they have nothing better to do than to make my life quite complicated, but not all of them operate in that fashion. And what I think is revelatory about at least the time I spent with these inspectors was that they aren't faceless cogs mindlessly implementing their directives. There's a certain, tacit knowledge, what James calls metis, sort of je ne sais quoi that they need to deploy in their daily engagements. And the best inspectors, what are considered widely in the ministry, the best inspectors, are the ones who deploy this in the sort of most efficient fashion. And they're the ones who are given sort of younger inspectors to train. And this was befuddling to me because I'm like, okay, you're breaking the rules, you're not following the diktats of the law, and yet you are celebrated within the ministry, not by the higher ups, but by the ones in the know. Like, yeah, those are the best ones because they have a sense, what Julia Elliott calls a sense of the market, in her case, thinking about public banks, right? A sense of what's going on here and how it is that people may cheat the system and how they may work around it. And so I figured it might be productive to begin to think about these bureaucrats as craftspeople in a sense, rather than just thinking of the bakers in that way, which was less of a leap, as you said, than thinking about bureaucrats who we associate with sort of tight, buttoned up, faceless cogs, rather than very knowledgeable people with distinct forms of knowledge about the industries that they tend to bring.
Yeah, and just to kibitz on that final point, I mean, I agree very much that we can't understand bureaucracy if we have this very flat or even the kind of ideal type picture of how a bureaucrat is supposed to work. And actually, bureaucrats or bureaucracy would not be so powerful and sometimes so damaging if people were in fact just cogs in that way, because it's much easier to break a cog than to evade a craftsperson. And so it is that kind of local knowledge capacity to maneuver that sometimes makes the bureaucracy that more oppressive, right? It's not always a good thing, but it makes it more effective in accomplishing aims. So yes, I really appreciated that,
No, absolutely. And I think this is one of the great things about governing Gaza, that it has that richness in the way people interact with the bureaucracy and the sort of knowledge that there are maybe not full workarounds, but subtle workarounds that might make either daily life more feasible or might help you achieve what it is that you're setting out to achieve. So yeah, no, I agree wholeheartedly.
But then you're still like back to Henny's sentence, which but then we're still part of the same system that you oppose. You're knitting yourself into it. And I think all of the actors, the bakers, the bureaucrats, and the customers are all as they find, because this book is replete with people trying to find their way around things, right? How to sell, make a little more money than you're supposed to, catch somebody that doesn't want to be caught, all of those things. But all of that work, all of that evasion of in a single instance builds the system in which everybody is replete in. And so that I wanted to ask you, I guess, as sort of comparing bread with some other infrastructures, other services, because that was another theme that came through in your conversations with your interlocutors, was a regular comparison of how bakeries work and how bakeries make them feel in comparison to other kinds and other sites of government service, notably water and electricity, which are inconsistent, expensive, and ill-functioning, and yet also crucial, right? So not unimportant for life. And so I wanted to ask what you think these comparisons might suggest about the special importance, particular place of bread and bakeries in the production of state and governing authority?
Yeah, no, it's great question. What came through in a lot of the sort of statements and some of the walks around town, I think it's chapter 2, where I sort of tag along to the bakery with people, is how precisely the bakery's exceptionality as something that always works and is always there engenders certain feelings, engenders certain attachments to political authority that do not come through as strongly vis-a-vis water, vis-a-vis electricity. Those services, I think, are also far more selective in their functioning. So water and electricity do work in some parts of Amman quite efficiently. Bakeries work everywhere. And so I think it was that contrast to me that was regularly remarked upon by most of my interlocutors that made it partly so powerful. It was also not just the moment of purchase, but also the fact that you sort of knew it was always there. And that the comfort that was provided by the fact that if we're in a pinch, we can just go to the bakery and buy a bunch of bread and the meal will get resolved rather easily. And you could never quite say the same thing about water or electricity. Something else my interlocutors often shared was that one can do without, not for long periods of time, one can do without water and electricity in ways that one cannot do without bread. This was their argument. Not sure I'm entirely convinced by it, but it is something that's sort of been embedded in the way a lot of them navigated the world. Electricity, you could go to someone's house and figure it out. Water, you could either buy water on the market or reuse water after you heated it, but you couldn't do quite the same with bread. Once there was no food, life became rather difficult. And so I think the comparison was also one of the ways I ended up with the sort of subject of study, because it was one of those things that people regularly praised in a place where government is not very often praised or commended. And so I think that was one of the other reasons why the comparison I found so powerful, and also made me think about other places where certain services work and others do not. Why people pay taxes because they're terrified of the IRS because they know that might work, versus the bus.
Not anymore. Now we know it.
Yeah, no, apparently not anymore. Exactly. But in the UK, they had the NHS, which stands out as this one sort of healthcare system that always appears to function while all these other things don't. And people form attachments via that reliability that then lead them to think about political authority, I think, in certain ways that are important to ponder.
Yeah, I mean, that leads me to actually really wonder, like, does it, if each place has kind of some may have more, some places, I guess Scandinavia, they have lots of different things that work, but if there is the thing that works, like how does that shape how citizens, subjects think about the state? If what works is healthcare versus what works is bread, that has to shape how we understand what the state is.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's one of the first fascinating contrasts that one sort of chase down in different contexts. Like I asked about this question in the trip to Iran, and there it was subsidized petrol, and the fact that you could just sort of drive forever or go for a joyride, as one can in the Gulf or parts of the Gulf, and how that was seen as benevolence of a certain kind, given that other things didn't work as well. I think it also, one of the things that chapter tries to think about is the modes of embodiment that transpire, the ways our bodies become connected to the state, vis-a-vis those certain services that work. There's a great book called Project Heat by Catherine Fennell that thinks about a housing project in Chicago, where heat was sort of automatically put on, and these housing projects were incredibly warm all year long in the summer and in the winter. And she sort of does her ethnography after the heat is no longer on, it's gone through austerity and cuts to municipal funding. And one of the things a lot of her interlocutors mourn is the lack of this heat that they had gotten used to. That is no longer, the state has like lost any semblance of benevolence. The one thing it used to do for us, it no longer does. And the feeling of betrayal is quite sort of present in her work. And I think it's something that we could also trace in places where governments cut services that people have become attached to, not just sort of the ways they speak about them, but also in the ways their bodies have become attached.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, and that connects to the question I want to ask you about welfare, thinking about welfare. So, again, at the center of your account is that this is subsidized bread, and a central key, maybe primary form of welfare. And so in the regulation of and the complex practices of making subsidized bread, in that are arguments about what the government owes people, what people owe each other, and what are the basic requirements of both life and good life. And I will say, when I kept when I was telling people about your book, I kept getting confused about whether it was states of subsistence or states of sustenance. And so I thought, there are two layers here. I think it's both. And so that's life, but also the good life, right? Even if this is the most basic thing. So one, that's, an invitation to reflect on that. But then sort of my question here is, the book ends by describing a major, massive change in the system of bread subsidies. So again, for people who haven't read the book, maybe explain that change. And then what do you think that change reveals about how those questions are being answered and contested in Jordan now?
Okay. So the book ends on the 2018. So there was a subsidy reform that is, in the long run, not ended up being such a large reform, but basically there used to be a standard price for anyone and everyone. So anyone could walk in. All of us in this room could walk in tomorrow to a Jordanian bakery and buy subsidized bread. They changed that to a cash disbursement for eligible citizens, which meant they put the range quite broadly. So people making, I think it was under about 40,000 JD a year, which is upper middle class in Jordan. And those people were, if you filled out a form, state employees got it, government employees got it automatically, sort of cash disbursement. But what it really was trying to do was cut out refugees and migrant workers from the subsidy. The claim had long been, and the IMF has furthered this claim, that most of the subsidy goes to Egyptian migrant labor, now Syrian migrant labor, and refugees, that they were inefficiently consuming what should be a program for Jordanian citizens. The sad part of this, what it says about the basic requirements of life and the good life, I think in this context, is that they somehow do not apply to foreigners, which I think is incredibly troubling and problematic. Because if you are not a government employee and you have to fill out the form, a lot of people are uncomfortable for very legitimate reasons, filling out form, putting their names on paperwork, giving away their address to a government that has shown itself to be rather repressive when it wants to be. And so those people no longer have access to subsidized bread, nor the cash disbursement. If you don't have a bank account, there's nowhere they can send you the cash disbursement, which is an automatic transfer to your bank account. So I think it says, and all the Jordanian ministers I talked about are very proud of this fact. And, one need not be familiar with the sort of pan-Arab discourse of solidarity that one saw across the region, especially in the Levant and places like Syria, Iraq, and Jordan for a little bit of time, to mourn the fact that now we have the government has reduced itself to just thinking about the well-being of Jordanian citizens and somehow explaining away everyone else as the responsibility of the UN or not their job. So I think it says something pretty terrible about the requirements of life, the requirements of the good life, and how they no longer apply to those who have been displaced in this country, and all sorts of analogies in places like the US, the UK, that we can also think about in those terms. In terms of the requirements of the life and the good life, I mean, one of the fascinating things about talking about the bread subsidy is that I'd always have someone pop up in the audience with a fascinating example from another place. And sometimes it'd be maize and tortillas in Mexico, and they're like, well, you can't have a meal without a tortilla. In the Gulf, it's rice, which is called aish, as bread is called in Egypt. And I once had a Russian audience member mention vodka. They're like, oh yeah, vodka used to be subsidized in the Soviet Union, and I think for a substantial period after. And the argument being that it kept the cold away in the winter, it made difficulties of daily life a lot more digestible. And so I do think it says something about the way people think about the basic requirements of life. I mean, I couldn't tell you how many, one of my standard questions when I met people and I explained what I was doing was, why is bread so important? And they're like, looked at me like I was crazy. You're not full if you don't eat bread. It's not a meal if you don't have it. You can't live without it. And so I do think it says something, it offers a window into very different places, thinking about what it is that is subsidized and how it is that governments go about doing it.
And in the shift from, so there are two shifts. There's a shift from everybody can access subsidized bread, but then there's also a shift in how. If it's, that it is, you get cash that will help rather, or you get the bread directly. And given how much you focus very eloquently on kind of this embodiment, right? What it means to have these kind of relationships. What difference do you think that, alongside the different constituency and the question of to whom do we owe something, which I think is a tragic change, but how do you think that relationship between those who are still in the relationship of being owed something will change as it moves from bread directly to cash for bread?
So great questions. I thought about this a lot. The most robust defense of cash, at least to my eyes, is Jim Ferguson, the Give a Man a Fish, this great book called Give a Man a Fish. And it's the broad argument being that it's far more efficient, in his case, studying sort of West Sub-Saharan African countries, it's far more efficient for governments just to give people cash than to try to do these subsidies. Why? Because these subsidies require manpower, people, bureaucracy. They require all sorts of government interventions, investments in particular public programs. And his argument is that usually these don't work. Money goes to waste, bureaucrats steal it, contracts are given to friends of friends, and all that money goes down the drain. Well, you just give cash to everybody, then they can do with it as they please. And he tries to argue that this is one way that we can use the tools of neoliberalism in order to promote sort of broadly left-wing outcomes. Because people, when they're given cash, often do far more intelligent things with it than governments would do. I think Ferguson neglects authoritarianism. I think he neglects the fact that some governments will also steal the cash and not necessarily disperse it. But then I think what he most fundamentally misses out on is the joy of the public, right? So Bonnie Honig, this political theorist, has this great book called Public Things, and the ways our lives tend to assemble around those things that are public. And I talk to my students now about this, and they look at me like I'm crazy, right? Public library, the plaza, the central square, if you will. And I find these places to be vital. I hope I'm not alone in finding them to be the sort of vital lifeblood of cities, especially places of assembly, as places of camaraderie, as hubs of friendship. And I think this is what Ferguson can't quite see about something like the bakery, that this is not just about feeding people. It's about offering a certain sense of the public to the public, especially amidst broader retractions of all sorts of things like public space that Jordan see, like a lot of other sites. And so how is that changing the relationship between those who are owed something? I mean, I think it's the Jordanian government, and there's a great PhD student in Chicago working on this, Adam Almquist, and he's trying to think about moral economies of self-reliance. So one of the things the Jordanian government is invested in doing is trying to wean people off government employment. Any chance they get, they're saying we can't guarantee jobs, go out and get work. They're trying to promote entrepreneurship, all of these things. And what they're basically, I think, trying to do is to transform radically that relationship between those who are owed and the ones who are paying off that debt. And I think some of the more interesting sort of Jordanian social movements are the ones that are trying to push back against that escape from owing the populace anything in terms of welfare, in terms of social redistribution, in terms of public spaces. And so, yeah, I mean, I think the relationship is being rapidly transformed. I don't know where it's going beyond the sort of dour predictions that we're hearing about neoliberalism everywhere, in a sense. But yeah, I mean, my sense, and still from when I go and when I talk to people there, is that they're invested in resisting that transformation, even though they know or seem to suspect that it's a fait accompli.
But it strikes me, from what we have been talking about in your account here, that the risk in this is not just to the people and the public, but to the state, right? So if the bakery and bread is the site that entangles people, that makes that, back to like, what is the thing that works? It's the thing that works. If it no longer is, it's working in another way, but if it's no longer the thing that works right now, money is fungible, right? You can get money from somewhere else.
Yeah.
But the bread made that way through these subsidies is only available that way. So I wonder what it will do, again, not just to the people in the public, but to the state to give up that site.
Yeah, no, I'm equally curious. I mean, many of you will have heard stories or seen pictures on Twitter of when the pandemic started and people were sort of told to stay at home in Jordan. The army went around handing around bread, which I think speaks to the commitment of certain people in the government to continue to provide what is widely considered a basic good. But I agree, yeah, wholeheartedly. Money is fungible. There's always a way to sort of find it. Not always, but it's a bit more malleable, if you will, than having subsidized bread at the bakery every day. What it means for how people will think about political authority, I'm not quite sure. I mean, I think the pandemic has so changed my notions of what it is that people will tolerate in terms of their daily lives and government interventions therein, that I think I need to spend a lot of time back in these places in order to really be able to answer that question, which I think is a great one, but don't think I have an answer.
We don't have any online questions yet, but maybe pause here to see if anyone here does.
I will so pause. Are there questions? Are there questions from the audience?
If not, feel free to continue.
Give it a minute. It can take a while.
I was curious, in your vignette, you talked about how originally the state subsidized bread was only really for the forces. That seems like crazy to me because I think Jordan is just like ubiquitous. Could you talk a little bit about how that happened? I mean, I know it's a long history, but any like key critical junctures?
Yeah. Oh, so this I really want to talk about. So before 1974, which I'll get into in a second, the UNRWA is providing most of for free in and around refugee camps, and some of that sort of filters out into broader society. People will take it from UNRWA and sell it in the corner or hand it around to their friends. But the Jordanian government does not have an apparatus capable of providing subsidized bread. Every once in a while, they'll flood the market with discounted flour when the US does this Food for Peace program that supports allied countries against the communist threat. And they do it especially around Black September, which has its whole interesting history. But basically what happens is that 1974, there's an army mutiny in Zarqa, and the army goes out into the street because of hyperinflation. So 1974, oil crisis, food prices are exploding around the world, and their big complaint is about sugar, because the Jordanian army consumes industrial amounts of sugar in cookies, in kak, biscuits they drink in the morning, and in tea, right? And so this army who had just fought Black September and had a victory, I wouldn't call it that, but they probably, some members of it would, they feel that it's unfair that their salaries are not growing at the rate of inflation. Not only that, that the food basket, the food prices of basic goods is also going up. So they go out for the first time in Jordanian history, only time in Jordanian history, onto the streets in their tanks and threaten the king with mutiny. Say, look, if something doesn't change, we're out. And the king is actually in the UK. He's about to go meet, I think, President Nixon for some sort of grand diplomatic, event. And he returns to the country in haste and spends 1 week, King Hussein, like notorious for not being interested in economic affairs, really, deliberating over what to do. And they come up with this thing that's kind of copied off what Egyptians had done about 15 years before, called the Ministry of Supply. And they decide to regulate the prices of a whole basket of goods, frozen poultry, formula for babies, curtains, carpets, a whole bunch of stuff. And the sort of the key parts of the basket are really bread, chicken, tomatoes, cucumbers. I think there's a fatouche basket, right? Price of all the ingredients. And bread ends up being what stays the longest, right? And there's a chapter in the book that tries to trace this transformation in what I call sort of building on Foucault's work in the way the government conceives of the population, right? So before 1974, government thinks about political loyalty, right? Thinks about neighborhoods through the prism of, are you loyal? Are you disloyal? Are you disloyal? How disloyal are you? What happens in 1974 is after this victory victory, quote unquote, in 1970, they begin to think about, okay, the threat is no longer the PLO, it's societal unrest, right? It's our own army going out to the streets and protesting. And so what happens is that with American foreign assistance, they flood the country with foreign wheat. This kills the Jordanian agriculture, wheat agriculture, which is another part, an interesting part of the story that I can get into. And they begin to subsidize bread, mainly targeting cities, because that's where unrest happens, right? And still in rural areas, people have their neighborhood oven, grow wheat in some cases for subsistence, and then make their own bread, or they would now begin to buy flour, but still make the bread at home. And so it's not that people weren't consuming bread beforehand, it's that bread was concentrated in certain areas where they grew. Something of Jarash, Irbid, Ramtha, north. In the south, there was far more rice, hence mansa, the sort of mainstay of cuisine in the south. And so what happens in 1974 is that all of a sudden these bakeries pop up all across these cities and towns in Jordan. And slowly, exactly what happened, what you sort of commented on about bread being everywhere, this is what occurs over a sort of 5 and 10 year period, right? You used to buy bread, you used to take your stuff, not buy bread, you used to buy flour and take it to the neighborhood oven. Your family, usually your wife in many cases, you spend hours of her day making bread. And this was one of the funny sort of parts of the story I would ask, especially people in the north, sort of farming communities, how do you feel about subsidized bread? And the men would complain about how the bread doesn't taste as good, it's not as great. All the woman was is wonderful. Like I used to spend 5 hours of my morning every day making this damn bread, and now I just get to go to the bakery or send someone to the bakery and they come back with bread. But yeah, the story is really centered around the 1974 event. Army mutinies, the king is terrified by it, and they create this thing called the Ministry of Supply, which begins to target society as a whole and really focuses. They even had stores that were just for members of the army and the bureaucracy. But subsidized bread was one of those things that everyone had access to.
This question comes from Nathan Brown. One of the most subtle changes I've seen in Egyptian governance has been a slow, most imperceptible rise in states' ability to monitor individual transactions. Surveillance, of course, but also shifts to electronic transactions, tools of e-governance that facilitate compliance, targeting the subsidiary subsidies, insinuating the state more deeply in daily life in ways that make the state a more consistent presence. Whether or not I am right for Egypt, did you see any changes over time about the techniques used with the supply of basic commodities in Jordan that reflect changing state techniques and capacity?
Great question, and something I'm sort of fascinated by. Absolutely, I saw similar attempts and shifts. I don't think as much as in Egypt, especially around bread, which will be what I can speak to. I mean, Egypt very successfully, quote unquote, implemented the smart card program, where you can go to the bakery with a card and get I guess 5 or 7 loaves of bread per individual. The Jordanian government hasn't been as successful in doing those sorts of things, but the attempt at e-governance is definitely there. People resist it quite heavily. I mean, when I was there before this 2018 reform, there was an attempt to do the smart card for bakeries, and they would call it, they would call it al-Bitaqa smart card, and there were all of these sort of cartoons and newspapers mocking this attempt, showing bakeries as these like Jetson, like Uber sort of technological spaces. And the punchline was always al-Bitaqa al-Ghabiyya, right? The stupid card, sort of mocking this attempt at e-governance and electronic transactions, because a lot of people don't have bank accounts. A lot of people resist the state's desire to survey. So I'm definitely seeing this. And I think this is one of the things that is like sort of underwritten about, especially on the Middle East, the extent to which, electronic transactions, surveillance, authoritarianism, we might call it, is slowly incrementing. There's this great book by Sasha Zuboff, which I'm guessing Nathan's sort of referencing, on surveillance capitalism. And if you go to the Gulf, it's everywhere. Like they know what people are spending on, how much they're spending, and this is without even dealing with the credit cards. And I find it absolutely terrifying. And the Jordanian government is absolutely trying to do it. I wouldn't say they've done it as much or as widely as the Egyptians, but there's definitely an attempt. And now they have the bank account numbers of everyone trying to access subsidized bread. And what they do with that in moments of uncertainty, I sort of tremble at the thought. Yeah, great question.
No other online questions at this time.
But we have an in-person question.
Could you go into more detail what the advent of US flour to the Jordanian meat? Because when I was in Jordan this past year, I went to a very interesting exhibit about that process, and there's this sort of new push to grow wheat, and you can at a restaurant, the pizza restaurant, you can go buy the actual flour, and they grow it out by City Mall, and like I'm curious to hear a bit of that story.
It's a great question. I mean, you'll know more about the more recent stuff than me. I'm guessing it's like the Al Baraka initiative. I think that's what it's called. They're trying to grow heirloom seeds in order to revive the Jordanian wheat industry. I wonder what you think in terms of it has a tinge of of hipsterism to it, which might not be all that sustainable in the long run, but I'm glad they're doing it, and it's sort of a very noble initiative. So the Americans, the American Food for Peace program, American government in the 50s, they did this in a lot of places. In Jordan, big influx occurred a bit later, basically starting in the 1950s. The US had a surplus of wheat. I'm going to do the clip notes of the story. And the government would buy that wheat in order to acquiesce farmers, mainly in the middle of America. And then they had all this wheat sort of sitting around. They thought, what do we do with this? And so they thought, okay, let's just give it to countries that need it. How do you define countries that need it? Open question. There's a great book by Nick Calather called Hungry World, if you're really interested in the story. But basically, they flood wheat markets of allied countries to avoid the communist threat. What happens in Jordan is they do this periodically. So it wasn't a consistent initiative for a few reasons. 1960s in Jordan is quite sort of tumultuous. People are worried about. But whenever the king's in trouble, they sort of show up with tons of wheat and flood the market. But basically what happens is that it just no longer becomes profitable to grow local wheat. So people very intelligently stop growing. So a few things happen. First is urbanization. So all these areas around City Mall, areas around the University of Jordan. The name's escaping. It's very fertile agricultural land, as you'll see if you go to any garden in these spaces. You throw a seed and have apples or mango in the summer. And all these areas used to be areas where you would have wheat grown. And so what happens is a combination of urbanization, rapid urbanization, especially in Amman and Idlib, two very fertile areas. The cutting up of land via inheritance. And then on top of that, the fact that the government was paying people less than the world market price for wheat. Exporting wheat is really hard on a small scale. And so if you don't have a local buyer, it's no longer profitable for you to grow the wheat. So everyone just started growing olive. And that is now far more profitable. And there are a few people trying. There's still a few wheat growers very north near the border with Syria. And they often played they would sometimes sell to the Syrian government, sometimes the Jordanian government. If the Syrian government was paying a higher price in a certain year, they would call friends in Syria and sell to the Syrian government as if it were Syrian wheat. But basically, the Jordanian government went from producing, or Jordan went from producing 40% of the wheat that was consumed in the country to producing 2%. And so, yeah, the flooding of American wheat just absolutely decimated industry, as it did in a lot of places. One of the weird, twisted benefits, if you will, of sanctions on Syria is that it ended up being the only country self-sufficient in wheat, because it didn't want to have to spend foreign currency on wheat. It had this really interesting research center in Aleppo. And so Syria for the very long, I think beginning in the late 90s, was completely self-sufficient, partly because it did not get these very generous donations of American wheat. The problem here too is that the Jordanian government accepted them all, right? Rather avidly. If you look at the diplomatic cables, they're sort of always asking for more. And so who is to blame in the story? I mean, yes, it's easy to blame American empire, but then why was the strategy not to grow more wheat domestically, incentivize farmers instead of gathering in the donations? Sort of big argument, at least in political economy stuff that I'm familiar with, is that the whole purpose was to acquiesce cities. And what you could do with foreign wheat is that it got into the port in Aqaba, you send it up to Amman, acquiesce the big cities and towns, and that's all you needed to do. You didn't have to worry about rural areas in Jordan, they were loyal. And so I think most of that story is probably right, but that's in broad outlines.
And we've got another online question. The IMF has been reported to actually oppose Jordan's decision to lifting bread subsidies in 2017. The Jordanian government, similar to the governments of most borrowing countries, is notorious for following policies dictated by financial institutions, including the IMF and World Bank, to continue to benefit from loans. Why do you think the Jordanian government went in opposition or went in the opposite direction by lifting bread subsidies in 2018?
This is a great question, which is has a bunch of answers. But the irony here, right? So in 2017, the IMF, which is tangentially involved in sort of Syrian refugee response, at least the financial side of it, they realize after years of saying no more subsidy, it's inefficient use of government resources, it's leaking. There's leakage in the program, which means the beneficiaries are not those who are paying the taxes. It's also inefficient because anyone can have it, so it's seen as economically aggressive, right? Because wealthy people can buy subsidized bread that they, in theory, don't need. So can five-star hotels. So can fancy restaurants. So the IMF and the World Bank are constantly, their standard recommendation, eliminate the subsidy. They realized in 2017 that it's an incredibly efficient way of reaching Syrian refugees. So like, okay, we have this massive displaced population. They're not amalgamated in camps. So we don't know where they all are. How can we reach all these people in an efficient, targeted manner? Well, there is no efficient, targeted manner. And so basically the IMF confesses to realizing that there is this wonderful thing called the universal bread subsidy that somehow reaches everyone. No questions asked, at a reasonable, affordable price, even for those in sort of very precarious situations. So the IMF actually tells the Jordanian government, after years of saying no, keep it there. We find it to be incredibly effective because the way it can reach everyone with very minimal bureaucracy compared to cash disbursements, compared to first surveying refugee communities and then getting them assistance, which would take a very long time, is something they're still trying to do, not particularly effective. The Jordanian government at the time has a prime minister, Hani Moudi, who's been a prime minister a few different times. Very interesting figure. And he is sort of buys into IMF orthodoxy and is sort of over the top in his acceptance of some of these recommendations. And Moudi, for some reason, really buys the story. He had also been a minister of supply 20 years before. Buys the narrative that it's the Egyptian migrant laborers who are eating all the subsidized bread. And I interviewed him a few times and always rail about these construction workers. So Egyptian migrant labor does a lot of construction work, who would have we call them bread parties, right? Just like 20, 30 loaves, there's bread everywhere. They're throwing away bread, hanging out. As if this was, as if it were true, which I don't know what he was seeing, but as if it were a way of vilifying those who were consuming what is broadly considered a basic good. And so he decides, okay, I'm not going to cut the subsidy in its entirety. I'm going to target it towards Jordanians, but I'm going to make it so that these wasteful migrant workers don't have access to it, right? And the Syrian refugees, he has the classic sort of one of the Jordanian government perspectives, which is it's not our responsibility, right? It's not our fault that things have happened there and they're here, and so the UN should take care of them, or other governments should. Jordan is a poor country, and therefore it's not our responsibility. So he takes about half of the IMF's recommendation and says, okay, fine, I'll keep it because I'm worried about what it'll say to our citizens, but I'm going to cut it for everyone else. And so I'd say he takes about, he takes a pragmatic, he does half of the IMF's bidding or its previous bidding, but doesn't do it entirely. And claims that it was going to be far more efficient. And the first year they implemented this program, they saved like 20 million, very, very little. Projected savings were 200 million, 300 million, all this bread that construction workers are eating. The other thing, the other reason he was so adamant about it is that he thought of it, and he is right in some respects, as a subsidy of business, right? So what a lot of business owners, small business owners, medium business owners, large business owners do in Jordan is that they will feed their workers, right, as part of their daily wage. And one of the things they do is you'll see them go to the bakery and buy kilos and kilos of subsidized bread. And it's a way of keeping wage costs lower. So Modi was particularly resentful of this because he's like, look, you should pay your workers a daily wage that allows them to have a realistic cost of living rather than depending on the government to subsidize their wage. And part of that story is right, but then you could also just raise them. And so those are kind of the mechanics of it. There was more going on in terms of the sort of current events. There was a pharmacy tax reform that he tried to put through that didn't. And so bread was the one thing he could get through. But those are the sort of details in a very broad sense.
I don't know anything about land ownership patterns, cultural land ownership, Jordan. I know, in Egypt, there's still some small scale land ownership left over from the Nasser era reforms that were not reversed by subsequent administrations. So there is some ability for the government to encourage very small scale peasant farmers to increase their wheat, the allocation of their land to wheat growing, and then to sell that to the government, for example, currently, right, to offset the sort of shortage of wheat that's coming from Russia and Ukraine. So was there ever any effort like that by the Jordanian government, or would it be effectively sort of impossible because it's all very concentrated land ownership?
So great question. So Jessica Barnes in the book gets into the Egyptian government and the small scale farmers, and they do try to incentivize heavily. Yeah, you're absolutely right. The Jordanian government has tried. So agricultural land ownership looks somewhat different, but there is some small scale farming. There's also a lot of sort of wealthy city dwellers who have a farm in rural parts where they have olives, and sort of sell olive oil to their friends or give away olive oil to people in the office, to neighbors. The government, starting around 2010, the U.S. has slowly the American government has slowly wound down this Food for Peace program, and now they do something that's called local purchasing. They try to purchase wheat from local areas if they are going to offer as foreign aid. And so Jordan, like a lot of other countries, found that it no longer had access to this free or discounted foreign wheat. And what they started doing was that they were paying above world market price to incentivize people to grow wheat. So, for example, if it was $400 a ton a few years ago to grow, that was the international market price for wheat, they would offer farmers $500. The idea being that they could then incentivize them to not just grow it for their own subsistence, but to sell a bit to the government. The extent of their success is that now, instead of maybe 0.5%, Jordan grows 2%. So it has made some impact, and you have a few initiatives like the one Matt mentioned that allow Ammanis to have local wheat in their pizza. But they have tried, for the last 10, 15 years. And what they do is they, sort of like the Egyptian government does a similar thing, they pay above market price. And I think they even they have agricultural extension branches throughout the country. And if you want to go back to growing wheat after having grown olives, they'll basically pay for the seeds, and they'll pay for the agricultural engineer to come by your farm and help you set up the irrigation system. So they've tried, and I guess the centrality of bread and wheat, and Jessica Barnes' book speaks more to this than mine, but these efforts at collecting wheat, so there's a wheat harvest, there's a big wheat harvest, they get tons of coverage in newspapers. And I'm always amazed because I'm like, this is 0.5 to 1% to 2% on a good year of your wheat. Somehow it captures the national imaginary in a way. There'll always be a farmer heroically threshing the wheat, and it's discussed and talked about in the news and talked about in newspapers. And so I think it speaks to the fact of people's attachments, that the initiative Matt described also speaks to people's attachments to locally grown wheat. So they've tried, starting about 15 years ago. The problem is once you convert your land to do something else, there are either apartments all over it, or housing, or changing crops is rather difficult, especially when it goes back to wheat, because it's rather expensive to stop. The olives take a while to grow, and then by the time they're there, that's when you start having a nice harvest, yearly harvest. So growing back to wheat was usually unprofitable and a lot of work. Water intensive. That's the other thing, right? So even if they grew everything that they could, it would not get close to 50%. And like a lot of countries, they bought into this competitive advantage theory. And so they say, well, just fight on international markets. The problem, as we see in situations like we're in now, is that there's not always wheat to be purchased on international markets, which can make things rather complicated.
One more question.
Can I ask it? I mean, I don't want to get in anybody's way, but I have. So I will just note, you already sort of spoke to, but I was going to ask you a question about the gender dynamics in this shift, because I was basically what you just said, I was very struck by the kind of gender of nostalgia there, that there, you have this move to the bakery becoming a very male space, and yet this longing for somebody else's labor to give you a different kind of sense of bread. So I'll just note that I was struck by that too. But I will ask as my last question, coming back to the anthropological ethnographic, whether you might say a little bit more about your use of the senses, and particularly smell, as an ethnographic method.
Yeah. Great question, and tons to say. So one of the things that I came late to was this wonderful sort of literature on the senses, on synesthesia, on the way our bodies are primed by certain things that are happening around us, into nostalgia, into attachments to memory, attachments to political authority in this case. And so one of the things that I kept being told, or kept being remarked somehow, was, you're walking around town and you can smell the bakery, and you can smell that it's working at full blast. And one of the things that I felt sort of unfulfilled by, even on the state literature in anthropology, which I think is quite sort of strong and rich, was that there was not enough about the senses and the body vis-a-vis political authority, how our bodies are primed, whether it be the sound of the siren of an ambulance, for the police, in some cases. And so one of the things I really enjoyed doing was walking around with people and talking about the smells of the neighborhood, and how that sort of primed them to think about the spaces they were encountering. And so one of the things I think is useful to ponder, and that the book tries to sort of push people to think about, is how our senses prime us to think about the forces that govern us, and how that might not always seem an obvious way to think about politics, especially amongst political scientists, but that I do think it's a rather sort of fruitful, because we're used to thinking about speech, right? Speech is an obvious political act. It's one of the things that we're sort of taught to think about, text, but then sounds and smells have deep political implications, I think. And in the case of the bakery, it was the smell of reassurance, the smell of upcoming friendship, upcoming camaraderie. And I think it's the bakery is at one of its more powerful moments. It's there. It has that sort of, we've all walked outside a bakery. It has that alluring scent you sort of can't resist. And I started thinking about smells, sort of smells that one encounters walking through a city. I feel like I was in Denver a few months ago. Cannabis smells everywhere. I'm like, what is this saying about people's relationship to consumption, to political authority? And so, I think it's one of those, I didn't do it enough. It's one of the things I would have liked to have done more of, but to try to think about the sensations. So David Panagia has a great book on sensation. The sensations that prime us to think about political authority, I think, are interesting and important. I think it's one of the things that the bakery does most powerfully and most connivingly. Right? We don't think about the smell as something that's like interpolating us as political subjects, but I really do think that's when it's at its most vicious and delicious.
I think that is a perfect note to end on. Thank you very much.